It's the Matt Sager Podcast, Friday, January 18th from New York City, where it is so cold right now. I'm looking at my weather app on the iPhone. I use Dark Sky, the highest rated weather app, and I believe the most accurate, but I think now it's incorrect. It says that right now in Manhattan, it's 34 degrees and feels like 34 degrees, and I respectfully disagree. For pretty much all week, it's felt roughly 34, 35 degrees. Absolutely. Today, it feels as though it's 7 degrees, and it's only going to get worse through the weekend. Now, the possible upside of this is that maybe if it's so cold that I can't get out there and function, if it's so cold that movie theaters close, that I may now end up delaying what was once something I really wanted to do, going to see Glass in theaters, the latest film from M. Night Shyamalan and the third movie in what is now the Unbreakable trilogy. Because even earlier today, I've spoken with friends of mine, critics and others who attended early screenings of the film, and not one person walked away happy from this movie. Many of them say that the first 40 to 60 minutes of the film are excellent. Most of them say it then just unravels and becomes this hodgepodge of poor decisions, bad editing, shooting when many of the cast clearly weren't available, so big cast members disappearing for large chunks of time. But everyone I've spoken with and every review I've read, seen on YouTube, or encountered anywhere else concurs that the ending is so maddening, so frustrating. They haven't told me what it is, which I appreciate very much. Please, no spoilers. But that it leaves you so angry at all three films. It in some way betrays the whole foundation for this unbreakable universe, such as it is. And I realize I absolutely own up to making it my number one most anticipated movie of 2019 when I made that list the other day. I will say, in my defense, to the extent I need or warrant defending, that in announcing Glass as my number one choice for most anticipated film, I was acknowledging that M. Night Shyamalan is probably the most uneven filmmaker, certainly the most uneven I've ever encountered, and possibly the most uneven in modern cinematic history. You know, he will pump out The Sixth Sense and an Unbreakable, and then go to very weird places with Signs and The Village and Lady in the Water, Last Airbender, and then produce an excellent film like Split, which interestingly, having yet to see Glass and having thoroughly enjoyed Split, I have done a little bit of thinking about Split. Maybe it's because of how many reviewers have talked about Glass and how there's this moment where you're very deep into the film before it veers off on a wild detour that essentially unravels the story all the way through to this apparently terrible ending. And in thinking about that, I feel that Split maybe sacrificed what could have been an even better movie. It was a great movie. I loved it, absolutely. And it was a very exciting premise, the idea that this beast could find himself facing off with David Dunn. And simply the return of David Dunn was very exciting. And yet it was tonally and structurally so out of sync with the entire rest of the movie. You know, you've got this amazing performance from James McAvoy as a man with dissociative identity disorder, many of those identities being pure evil. Not talking about the beast, talking about like Dennis, and I believe Patricia was the evil woman personality who conspired with Dennis, and the two of them abducting these young girls, the host of all these personalities himself, the real live Kevin Wendell Crumb, who periodically for brief moments actually gets to control his own personality, or as it's referred to in the film, step into the light, regain the light. Everything about that story was fascinating. Elements of it were over the top enough that it could be considered mildly supernatural, but really it was a crime thriller. It was a psychological horror movie, quite literally, in that, let's just say, not all mental health professionals fare very well in Split. Without giving anything more than that away, you can imagine that a guy like Kevin Wendell Crumb, or the Horde as he called himself, running around with all these disparate personalities, the good ones being generally like kids, like this guy Hedwig, who's like permanently 9 years old. The ones with any sort of decent inclinations, civilized inclinations, being obviously subsumed by Dennis and Patricia. And there isn't really a need, once you're 8/10 of the way through the movie, to then really introduce the beast, a guy who's not just evil or not just good or not just weird, not any of the amazing 24 characters that James McAvoy plays, which, even if it were just him alone on a screen, would have been an amazing movie. But him abducting these girls, killing people, that is plenty of movie right there. Before you suddenly need to change the way you've suspended your disbelief and go, oh, okay, one of his personalities can climb walls and bend steel. All right. No explanation whatsoever, but cut to credits. And before you have a moment to think, boy, that was a kind of weird decision. And, you know, every single thing about this movie was basically plausible and acceptable and understandable and terrifying for that reason. Why would they suddenly introduce this actual monster and leave all the questions about him and every detail about him unanswered. But before you get to have that thought, before I got to have that thought, there was a real quick title card letting you know the movie was over, and then a pre-credit scene, as opposed to Marvel's post-credit scene, of what was actually rather poor, stilted dialogue. Because they're talking about this raving lunatic who's killed people and abducted others, and David Dunn is at a diner. Spoiler alert for the end of Split here. David Dunn's at a diner, wearing his rain poncho, being very inconspicuous. And as the people at the diner are watching TV footage of the Horde, Kevin Wendell Crumb, running around like an animal, and they hear the name The Horde used for the first time on TV. Out of nowhere, rather than going, Jesus, why is there a naked man on TV and how did he kill all these people? Or could he change the channel to sports? Just very abruptly out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, a customer goes, you know, that kind of reminds me about that guy who blew up the train. What did they call him? And in what way does Kevin Wendell Crumb remind you of Mr. Glass? What actual, I know as moviegoers we get it, but what actual threads? If you're some person in a diner and you've been made aware of the second heinous crime committed by a psychopath in the area in which you live, and it's been 18 years since then, maybe just 16 years actually. I believe that 2016 was the year that Split came out. But it's been more than a decade by far. What other than being crazy killers do these people have in common? Mr. Glass did not in any way make himself a public figure. He hid. He stayed in the shadows. He loved the idea of being a supervillain, and he dressed like one, but he couldn't get around. He couldn't move, and he operated behind a very civilian facade. Even when he gave himself up, admitted his identity to David Dunn, he was at his art gallery. He was sitting in his chair doing nothing. He was not running around in a lupine form, ass naked, literally, and screaming about multiple personalities. So this was extremely stilted, awfully convenient, and honestly rather lazy dialogue. However, for what it was meant to accomplish, earned or unearned, in my eyes it did, in immediately planting the seed that, guess what, people? This is part of the Unbreakable trilogy, and there's another movie coming where all these people are going to get together and fight one another. And the prospect of that was genuinely exciting to me. But it was clearly a technique meant to either mimic or sort of share some set of attributes with, the kind of stuff you saw at the end of Iron Man, of every Marvel movie, really. And I hate to say that about Shyamalan, who was making great superhero films in the form of Unbreakable before there was a Marvel Cinematic Universe. But it seems to me that what he did was take those post-credit sequences that either featured the super teams, the villains, or Nick Fury or Agent Coulson, who in a rather lazy and stilted way themselves, in many cases, set you up for what was going to be the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, I got reports of a hammer landing near Omaha. Wonder what that could be about. Cut to closing credits. As cool as it is in theory, although apparently not in fact, although again, I will weigh in on this when I see it. As cool as it is in theory to have an Unbreakable trilogy, I don't think that Split benefited from being a part of that. I honestly think it was a perfect movie as it was, before two things. One, the idea of the supernatural and this becoming part of the Unbreakable universe. And two, another spoiler here for Split. The whole idea that out of everyone he'd abducted, he released this one girl because he saw in her that she'd been damaged, whereas everyone who's pure and unharmed and undamaged in some way is worthy of death. Now, really, is there anybody who is truly undamaged? A. And B, where did this philosophy come from, this murderous idea that anyone who hasn't already suffered terribly, I gotta fix that by killing them? That is an interesting idea if explained. If just uttered and then never followed up on. If it's just an excuse to let one character live so she can return for Glass, which appears to be the case, then that too took away from what could have been a real new renaissance for Shyamalan. Like Sixth Sense level. And I believed at the time that Glass would be the movie that cemented or re-cemented Shyamalan as the king of this bold new storytelling genre. And apparently it's just clearly not the case. So I now find myself dreading the prospect of going to see it over the weekend, which I feel I must, because on this very podcast, just a few days ago, I named it as my #1 most highly anticipated movie of 2019. I will admit that the rash of just horrible reviews, worse than the Lady in the Water reviews mostly, although that may well be because people walked into it with very high expectations, having enjoyed Split and Unbreakable so much. But having seen this response from people I know, from people I don't know, but people I trust, and pretty much everyone, that it's a terrible movie, I now feel like it's homework I must do. Because I promised you I'd see it and review it, and I owe it to myself, really. It wouldn't be the first time I left something that everybody thought was somehow subpar and found myself enjoying it quite a bit, but it would certainly be the most extreme version of that that's ever happened to me. Like, people often ask me, what's your favorite Joss Whedon show? And I'll generally say Angel, and whoever had asked me the question and everyone in the room looks at me like I'm a lunatic. lunatic. Not that they disliked Angel, but that between that, Firefly, and Buffy, it didn't seem like an obvious choice as best show. But that is a minor quibble. It's a different situation than saying, hey, I went to see this movie that everyone on the internet, every film reviewer from all mediums, and all of my friends and colleagues and coworkers, many of whom have just about the exact same tastes as me, despise. That I saw it and I loved it. That seems implausible. So it is a silver lining on an otherwise merely cold, dry, snowy, and just generally unpleasant bunch of days coming up here in New York City that I could say, oh, I really tried to go see Glass and I just couldn't make it work. With the cold and the snow, theaters are closed, employees can't come in because they live out of town, they commute in from Jersey or Long Island, so it'll have to be next week. And I thoroughly recognize I can't put this off forever, nor do I really want to. Even if it's bad, I do want to see how this thing ends. Although I am steeled for a disappointing result. Now, what I'll definitely be doing this weekend, don't have to leave home to do it. In fact, you can't. Is doing lots of Netflix watching. Because, well, first of all, I neglected to mention this earlier in the week, but on Monday, Hulu beat Netflix to the punch. And Netflix, who just today released their Fyre Festival documentary called Fyre, F-Y-R-E. Based on the festival a couple years ago that was a complete scam, that promised luxurious housing and instead had FEMA tents, that promised luxury cuisine and instead had military rations. The organizer claimed to have owned an island to which he had no claim whatsoever. It was just a big, huge disaster. Ja Rule was involved. He was the co-organizer, in terms of credit at least, along with this lunatic, Billy McFarland, who has a long history of being a con artist, saw a moment in America's history that he was living in real time, in which times have never been better for con artists and flim-flam men. I know I've said this before, but I really can't recommend to you highly enough the book Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, about Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, her boyfriend Sonny Balwani, I think was his name. These people made billions off of a lie. Craig Carton, a disc jockey formerly here in New York City at our sports station, WFAN, he hosted a morning show along Boomer Esiason. He managed to commit every fraud there is. Regular fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, ticketing fraud, all sorts of different fraud charges of which I don't know all their names. But we are still in a golden age of con artists. I believe we're coming out the other side, but the years 2014 to 2016 were a time when being a con man was a great business to be in, although one with consequences. So Fyre comes out today on Netflix, but on Monday, Hulu had a film out called Fyre Fraud. Beat Netflix to the punch. A very dirty move in the streaming wars, which, as I predicted, are already heating up quite a lot. We just barely entered the new year. But so to everyone's surprise, with very little promotion or fanfare, this Fyre Fraud appeared on Hulu on Monday, and it is fantastic. If the Netflix movie is even half as good, it will be a masterpiece in nonfiction. What Fyre Fraud had that I don't believe Fyre has is an actual one-on-one interview with the producer of the movie and Billy McFarland himself before being sentenced. And there is this amazing exchange. Minor spoiler here. I won't tell you how it ends. But I will say that one of the questions asked of McFarland is, many people call you a sociopath. How do you feel about that? What are your thoughts? So I recommend both of those very highly. Again, not having seen Fyre with this whole Glass thing going on, I'm a little bit once bitten, twice shy. So I can definitely recommend Fyre Fraud. But I'm going to watch Fyre tonight, and I bet you it's just as good. So if you've got Hulu, if you've got Netflix, you can definitely watch The Art of the Con. And of course, the other thing I'm going to be very busy doing on Netflix, probably all night. I don't expect to sleep until sometime late tomorrow, because The Punisher Season 2 is out, and I'm extremely excited about that. It was announced only a few weeks ago, and since then there's been all these trailers released online, many scenes. Unlike Glass, nary a negative review to be found. Some criticism, but not wow, this feels like I've been betrayed, stabbed in the gut. It's also going to be the very last time, this coming from Deborah Ann Wall herself, that we'll get to see Karen Page in the Marvel Netflix universe. It's very sad. I absolutely understood why Netflix chose to cancel Iron Fist. I would have done the same thing. I would have written letters asking them to at a certain point. That show is terrible. And yes, The Defenders was a huge disappointment. But Daredevil continued to be an amazing show. Luke Cage continued to be a great show. Jessica Jones continued to be a wonderful show. And The Punisher showed so much promise with just the one season. And I was afraid that they were going to just can season 2. Literally can it. Because it was produced several months ago. And absent a release date after the news of the Daredevil cancellation, I thought, oh, geez, we're not going to ever see Punisher season 2, even though it's been made. Or Jessica Jones Season 3. And Punisher Season 2 has in fact been released. And I'm going to go binge it tonight and hope for an announcement to follow shortly for an air date of Jessica Jones Season 3, which sadly, while I do believe it will air, will mark the end of the Marvel Netflix universe, which is a shame. Not as much as a shame as being an attendee at the Fyre Festival, or even as big a shame as hyping up Glass and then being embarrassed when you find out it looks like a dud. But a shame nonetheless. Anyway, get in touch with the Matt Sager podcast over the weekend, why don't you? You can email me, matt@mattsager.com, or call 646-535-4788, or get me on social media. Let's see, on Twitter, I'm @MattSager. On Instagram, I'm Real Matt Sager, and on Facebook, I'm all over the place. Got my homepage for myself, my person, The Matt Sager. Got my voiceover page, Matt Sager VO. And most importantly, if you're listening to this podcast, you want to go to my podcast page, which is Matt Sager Podcast. Also, check out the links in the description for tonight's podcast episode, for links both to the 2 Fyre Festival movies, one from Hulu, one from Netflix, and links to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Matt Sager, and my merch store from my very good friends at wehavemerch.com, where you can get Matt Sager Podcast coffee mugs, hoodies, t-shirts, stickers, and much more. Really cool stuff. I advise you check it out. And for everything else, my voiceover reels and contact information, more social media profiles if that wasn't enough, my blog posts and articles, archived back episodes in this podcast, and much, much more. You can find all that on my website, mattsagervoiceover.com.